We've seen plenty of speculation that Khalil Herbert is on the roster bubble at Chicago Bears training camp. Certainly, DeAndre Swift is going to take a lot of his playing time, but Herbert is far too valuable for the Bears to just get rid of him.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we look at Khalil Herbert's present and future in this Chicago Bears backfield in the context of DeAndre Swift's addition, what that means for Herbert and certainly Roschon Johnson behind them on the depth chart, how Herbert fits into this mix with Swift being the new top guy, but why it doesn't mean Herbert's going to be cut or traded at training camp. He certainly is still a lot more valuable to the Bears than he would be to any other team in a trade, and way too valuable to just cut altogether. So we'll look at how Shane Waldron uses running backs, how DeAndre Swift has been used, how Khalil Herbert has been used, and maybe how he could be used better or more than we've seen in the past, and somewhere Roschon Johnson is going to fit into all of this as well. But I think what started bringing this up for me first and foremost was actually the offseason hard knocks of the New York Giants. I promise this ties back into the Chicago Bears here very quickly. They have done a great job of showing a bunch of behind-the-scenes stuff of the Giants front office going through free agency and the draft and stuff. And part of that was a clip where one of their executives was giving their scouting report on DeAndre Swift as the Giants were considering him as a potential Saquon Barkley replacement. So we got a glimpse at how another team viewed the Bears free agent signing as a free agent while he was still available and didn't ultimately end up choosing to sign him in New York. Now, we don't have the rights to play the HBO video or audio here on the podcast, but I do have the quote transcribed for there's kind of two parts of it here from Giants Director of Pro Scouting Chris Rossetti, who said, quote, "This guy from a physical talent standpoint can make up some of the things you lose with Saquon." So clearly they liked his pass catching ability, his explosiveness, a lot of the things that we all liked about DeAndre Swift. But Chris went on to say, Chris Rossetti, the Giants Director of Pro Scouting, went on to say, if you're signing him, he's going to be more of a package player. You're going to pair him with somebody in a committee style. So the Giants didn't see DeAndre Swift as this pure workhorse running back. Still a running back who's valuable and talented and like gives you, like he said, gives you a lot of the stuff that Saquon Barkley that they lost from the Giants, but you know, it's not like he's going to play every single snap. The other running backs are going to be important in this equation. And so that leads me to the Chicago Bears, right? Where, okay, maybe the Bears scouting report of Swift is not exactly the same as the Giants there, and maybe they could envision him in a bigger role. But that wasn't how Shane Waldron used running backs in Seattle very much. And the Bears do have a lot of talent in the running back room. I think they'd be a little bit foolish to just say, nope, no need to use Khalil Herbert or Roschon Johnson or Travis Homer or whoever. We're just going to have DeAndre Swift do everything. Instead, there is going to be a role here for one or two other running backs beyond Swift. And we've all been pretty quick to say, well, there goes Khalil Herbert. He's the runner only, and Roschon Johnson's the better pass catcher and pass protector. So he's going to be the number two, and then maybe the Bears will just trade or cut Khalil Herbert at that point. And we'll get into the value side of things and why cutting him or trading him really wouldn't make much sense for the Bears, even if that were the case with Roschon Johnson. But first I want to get into this other running back role with DeAndre Swift, both looking at kind of some Swift stuff, but also some Shane Waldron stuff. Like, for example, you look at his running backs in Seattle last season, 2023. They had Kenneth Walker Jr., who was almost the Offensive Rookie of the Year. I think he finished second in Offensive Rookie of the Year voting 2 years ago, now in his second season last year. And then Zach Charbonnet, was it Charbonnet? I don't know if you pronounced the T in his last name. The rookie running back for them out of, I think, UCLA. an interesting duo there where clearly Walker was the number one running back. He had 219 carries for 905 yards and 8 touchdowns. He was a 1,000-yard back the year before. Like, he was definitely their number one back, but also a running back who is a good receiver out of the backfield. He led the running backs in receiving yards as well. 259, had 29 catches, 37 targets. Like, this is not to say that Walker and Swift have the same skill set exactly or the same running back, but like the Bears now, the Seahawks last year with Waldron had a number one running back who's a very good runner and a very good receiver. And I think we see DeAndre Swift, albeit in different ways, as a very good runner and a very good receiver. And yet, Waldron still had a second running back role for Zach Charbonnet last year as even a little bit more of the pass-catching number two back. Like, you look at how they were used in that offense. They actually played a very similar number of total snaps. So Walker had 219 carries and Charbonnet had 108 carries, like more than double the carries for the starting running back there. Of course, Walker was their number one running back and their lead back. But in terms of total snaps, when you include every play they're on the field for, not just the plays they're getting the ball, not just the plays they're running routes, not just the plays they're pass blocking, but even plays where someone else gets the ball, where they're run blocking even. They played almost the exact number of total snaps. Walker played 500, Charbonnet played 475. Like, there were only 25 more plays last year that Walker was on the field than Charbonnet. Like, the two running backs, in terms of total playing time, were almost equal. But clearly, Walker got the lion's share of the carries, and Charbonnet got about half as many carries. But Charbonnet had more total routes run and more pass protection snaps. And that seemed to be kind of the split here. Like, the number one running back for Shane Waldron will get all the carries, we'll get most of the carries, and we'll still run a lot of routes. But the number two back will come in and run even more routes and be more relied on to be the pass protection back. A lot of third downs and passing situations for the number two back after the number one back was, your first and second down guy, getting some carries and even some pass catching opportunities there. So it's not to say that Waldron is going to take the exact split that he had in Seattle and then plug DeAndre Swift and Khalil Herbert or Roschon Johnson into those exact roles, because he's got different players and he's going to use the rotation, what's going to be best for them. But it is to say that the number one back in this offense isn't going to just dominate all the snaps, and that seems to split where DeAndre Swift is coming in and how the Giants had viewed him in their sort of, behind-the-scenes scouting evaluation, and that the number two back in this offense is likely going to have to be somebody who catches a lot of passes and offers a lot in pass protection and still carries the ball some, maybe half as much as the starting running back, but still has to be able to be a good runner as well. But seems like receiving and blocking is going to be a little bit more of the emphasis there, which again lends itself to what we think of Roschon Johnson as opposed to Khalil Herbert not having the reputation of being particularly effective as a pass catcher or a pass blocker out of the backfield. And I also want to refute that just a little bit. I certainly agree that is the reputation, is that Khalil Herbert offers you very little in the passing game, and that's his big weakness. And I think that's true for pass blocking, but I think he's a better receiver out of the backfield than we give him credit for. And depending on how you look at this, I think it's more about the scheme and the opportunity Khalil Herbert has had than his actual ability as a running back, his talent as a receiver out of the backfield. I think it's more about how he's been used as opposed to a lack of his own individual ability to produce in that way. So we'll go through some of the numbers and where Khalil Herbert, as a receiver, performed statistically very similar to Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley last year. That's next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. I use the Gametime app all the time. I actually got tickets tonight as this podcast is coming out. I'm going to Wrigley Field to see Steve Miller Band, Journey, and Def Leppard, and I bought my tickets on the Gametime app on my phone because I could see my view from my seat in Wrigley Field, so I knew exactly what my view of the concert is going to be, and their all-in pricing made it so that there weren't any added fees at the end of my ticket purchase, so I knew exactly how much I was going to pay for those seats before I had to go through the whole ticket buying process. But it's not just concerts. It's baseball games all summer long. It's football games coming up this year. I mean, any sport, concerts, comedy shows, theater, I mean, you name it, they've got it at Gametime. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Khalil Herbert has not had great production as a receiver in his 3 seasons with the Chicago Bears. No one is here to say, he's actually some perfect aficionado out of the backfield that's going to be this super weapon in the passing game. Like this past season, I think was his best year as a receiver, was 20 catches for 134 yards. Not in any way like, when you think about fantasy and PPR and receptions and stuff, like not moving the needle a ton there. But I'm more convinced that, albeit it's been a small sample size, but I think for Herbert as a receiver, it's been much more about how he's been used than his actual ability. I think you can get a lot more passing production out of Khalil Herbert if you ask him to do that and give him the opportunity to do so. His pass protection, the pass blocking, is still a big weakness and his biggest flaw, I think, or his biggest impediment to earning more playing time behind DeAndre Swift this season. But I want to go through Herbert as a receiver here because I think you'll be surprised, and I think it'll illustrate kind of how running back production as a receiver is so often a little bit more out of their control. Like, if we think about this conceptually, right? Like wide receivers running routes downfield, like the quarterback is looking to see, is this player open? It also depends on, where they are in the progression. But like a wide receiver, his ability to like run a really crisp route they have a lot of control then over whether or not they're going to get the ball thrown their way, right? Like it's up to them to be a good route runner and to create separation to then be open. And the quarterback also still has to see them and be able to deliver the throw. But like the wide receiver has a decent amount of control over his ability to get open and potentially get the ball from the quarterback. A running back in the backfield has a lot less control over that for a couple of reasons. One, when you think about the types of routes that a running back runs out of the backfield, like Khalil Herbert, I was looking at his routes run last season and his targeted routes. Most of them were on what they call flare routes, where sometimes those are considered swing routes, the same kind of thing, right? Where essentially you're going horizontal, parallel with the line of scrimmage, right? And kind of flaring out and looking back at the quarterback, but you're more or less lingering in the backfield. You're not even necessarily running full speed. You're not sprinting to the sideline. You're kind of just, flaring out. I mean, that's why they call it a flare route. You're swinging out to the flat a little bit. So you're not running full speed, trying to run this crisp route to create separation for yourself, right? You're occupying a space on the field to stretch the defense underneath a little bit so that there's more space upfield for the receivers, right? If you're a threat back there, somebody's got to come closer to you, so then they can't cover farther away. And, it's a way of stretching the defense. But it's not the running back being able to put a move on his defender and then, break free and he's open. He's just flaring to the side. Like Herbert's 2 most common routes last season were flare routes out of the backfield and screen passes. Those are not plays where Herbert is showing off route running ability and ability to create separation for himself. The other side of that is when you're running these flare and swing passes, you're usually last in the progression, right? The quarterback is looking for wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, tight end, wide receiver 3, and if all else fails, okay, there's the running back. He's the check down in the backfield. So you're not even on the quarterback's mind as like where he wants to go with the football. Rarely is the running back the primary target on the play. Certainly rarely, if ever, for Khalil Herbert. And in this Bears offense in the past couple of seasons, the running backs have not been prioritized in the passing game in a lot of those ways. And so Herbert has just been used purely as a check down type guy. He hasn't had a lot of opportunities to run other routes. And maybe that's a reflection of the team not trusting him to do more than that. But I also think it's a product of the scheme where a lot of the running backs weren't asked to run a lot of different kind of routes. They were all just kind of like check downs and get what you can from it. And even in that role, in a small sample size, Khalil Herbert did pretty darn well. And to me, like, the numbers reflect a guy who just doesn't get enough targets as opposed to a guy who doesn't deserve more targets. Like, if you look at Khalil Herbert as a receiver last season, He targeted 28 times for, 20 catches, 134 yards, and a touchdown. Nothing crazy. But he only ran 127 routes out of the backfield. So 28 targets on 127 routes is 0.22 targets per route. 22% of his routes he gets targeted on. That's the same percentage as Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. They all have gotten targeted on about 22% of their routes run last season. McCaffrey had 58 targets on 264 routes. Barkley had 79 targets on 367 routes. They all get targeted at the same rate. Herbert just runs fewer routes. They give him fewer opportunities to do so. And yet, on those plays that Herbert actually gets thrown the ball, his yards per catch yards after the catch on each of those catches. Because a lot of times he's catching them in the backfield. So we want to look at what he does after he's got the ball in his hand. 6.7 yards after catch per reception. On average, when he catches the ball, he will take it 6.7 yards further than where he caught it. That is more than Saquon Barkley, who averaged 6 yards after catch, and Christian McCaffrey had 6.8 yards after catch per reception. So Herbert and McCaffrey were 0.1 different in yards after catch per reception last season. It's just that McCaffrey had way more catches and Barkley had way more catches, but Herbert was doing just as much with the ball once he caught it than McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley last season. Herbert had more missed tackles on receptions last season than Christian McCaffrey, and the same number of missed tackles on receptions as Saquon Barkley, despite having a lot fewer total catches to record missed tackles on. Like, he had 6 missed tackles on 20 catches last season. Barkley had 6 missed tackles on, I actually don't have his totals in front of me, hold on. Barkley had the same number of missed tackles on, 41 catches. So on literally double the Khalil Herbert was breaking tackles at double the rate as a receiver as Saquon Barkley. And of course, McCaffrey only had 5 missed tackles on quite a few more catches as well. So Herbert is generating the same yards after catch as McCaffrey and Barkley and breaking more tackles after the catch than McCaffrey and Barkley, and is getting targeted about as often on his routes. Like, he's getting open, quarterback is throwing it to him as often as McCaffrey and Barkley. He just doesn't get as many routes to get the ball thrown to him. So yes, it's a smaller sample size with Herbert, and I'm not here to say he's as good as Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley, but I think it's evidence that, hey, maybe if you threw the ball to Khalil Herbert more and made him more of a priority in the offense, he could do more with it. He just hasn't had a lot of those opportunities to catch the ball, but when he does, his efficiency numbers in terms of yards after catch and missed tackles is on par, or last season was on par with McCaffrey and Barkley. Like, I'm not trying to make more out of that than it is. It's just I'm not trying to say he's something great that we haven't seen yet. But like, all I'm saying is that looks like a running back who could do more as a pass catcher if you threw him the ball more. And he wasn't getting thrown the ball a lot because he was their number 1 running back. Like, they needed him to be that first and second down guy. And much like DeAndre Swift and others, like, he can't do everything. So he can't be your workhorse running back and your top receiver all the time. You know what I mean? Like, you can't do everything for him. And so I think part of it is that, and part of it is maybe some lack of trust or whatever it might be. And part of it is, Luke Getsy's offense maybe not getting the running backs as involved in the passing game as effectively as you would like to see. And so that's where I'm not ready to count Khalil Herbert out of this number 2 running back battle, because I think he can be a really effective receiver with the ball in his hands. Pass protection is going to be the real challenge here, and that's where Roschon Johnson is already better, and we need to see progress from Khalil Herbert in that regard. But even if Roschon Johnson surpasses Herbert on this depth chart for the number 2 running back, and Herbert is now number 3 after Swift and Roschon Johnson, they still aren't going to cut him. And I don't think there's really a lot of value in trading him either. So we'll look at what that might look like, even if Herbert doesn't get the opportunities that I think he could make the most out of, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides online therapy to help you be your best self. So often we compare ourselves and our lives to other people and look at what other people have or what other people have done and think, why don't I have that, or why haven't I done that? Despite we have no idea what other things they're going through or what other things they've gotten that have helped them get there, that have put them along that you don't have access to. I mean, we just can't know And those comparisons are never fair and never really good for us either. Comparison is definitely a thief of joy. And therapy can help you focus more on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. So if you've been thinking about starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try because it's entirely online, it's convenient, flexible, and suited right to your schedule. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. As always, we're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And our Locked On Podcast Network has all of your favorite teams covered with Locked On local shows. So go check out Locked On Cubs, Locked On White Sox, Locked On Fighting Illini, Locked On Blackhawks, or, if you like other non-Chicago teams, we've got you covered as well. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. It's your team every day. And we know every day we're going to be looking at this Bears training camp battles, including the running back position, where it's going to be a real battle between Roschon and Khalil Herbert. And I think we can make a strong argument. I think we just made a decent argument for Herbert having more of a battle there to be a receiving back in this offense than we may have initially thought based on how we've seen him used up to this point. I think he can be more effective as a receiver than what we've seen. Pass protection, we'll see. The Bears running backs coach Chad Morton is teaching the Bears running backs a different style of pass protection. It's a different technique than what they've been taught before. So maybe that'll work better for Roschon. Maybe that'll work better for Khalil. Maybe it'll work better for DeAndre Swift. I mean, we'll see. But it'll at least maybe offer a little bit more change in that regard than just assuming what they did last season as pass blockers is what they're going to be this season as pass blockers. But even if we go through this process, and Roschon takes a big step in year 2 because he was very good as a receiver last season. He had even better numbers than Herbert and McCaffrey and Barkley in that group, and is the better pass protector. There's certainly a path here for Roschon to win this out, and next year Roschon will be the number 2 running back either way. Even if Roschon is the number 2 this year, the backup for Swift in that committee role that we talked about in the first segment, Khalil Herbert's not just going to get cut. Like I just can't envision a scenario where the Bears go through training camp and say, we don't need Khalil Herbert. Cut him. Let him go play somewhere else. Like he's a really good runner. We've just demonstrated like he's got receiver ability here, and he's young and he's cheap. Like there's no like these are the players you loved. Like why would you just get rid of talent for no reason? Like I cannot envision a scenario where they just cut Khalil Herbert at the end of training camp. Like I mean, unless there was like some kind of non-football off the field thing, but like there's no normal X's and O's training camp battle that results in Khalil Herbert being cut. The more realistic outcome could be Khalil Herbert traded to a team that might need a running back or has a big running back injury and sees him available on the Bears, and the Bears say, okay, we can get by with Swift and Roschon and Travis Homer and the undrafted free agent kid, and we can trade Khalil Herbert. That's not out of the question by any means. But I don't think that means Herbert is on the trade bubble. I don't think the Bears are going to try and shop Khalil Herbert around. But B, I'm not even sure if the trade of Khalil Herbert would be worth it to the Bears. Like I don't think a team is going to give the Bears anything more than a late round draft pick. If a team was going to trade for Khalil Herbert, it's because they have a running back injury or whatever, or they just somehow realize they need a lot more talent at that position, and they're going to go see who they can get for cheap. And they're not going to give up a 3rd round pick for Khalil Herbert. They're not going to give up a 4th round pick for Khalil Herbert. Probably not even going to give up a 5th round pick. I mean, we're talking a 6th or a 7th round pick. Because, I mean, you can look out in free agency right now and say, okay, is a team going to give you a 5th round pick for Herbert when they could go out and sign, I think, Damian Harris, Cam Akers, Kareem Hunt, Latavius Murray, Matt Breida, like Jerick McKinnon? Sure, like you could argue Herbert's better than maybe even all those guys, but are you going to give up a draft pick for a guy, or you could just sign a guy off the street for not for free, but without having to give up trade compensation for him? Like, and there may be other running backs that get cut that they could just claim on waivers instead of giving up a high draft pick for Herbert, right? There's not a lot of incentive for another team to give up a premium draft pick for Herbert. So you'd be looking at, I think a 6th or a 7th round pick seems realistic. Maybe they give you a 5 and you trade them a 6th as a pick swap with Herbert, but like, let's just say for all intents and purposes, a 6th or a 7th round pick. Is that worth moving on from Khalil Herbert for a 6th or 7th round pick, the latest of late round picks. I mean, we don't see a ton of those guys, especially 6 and 7 pan out. We've seen 5th round picks pan out, but like 6th and 7th round picks don't often make your 53-man roster. And I guess Herbert was a 6th round pick himself, but which is ironic in this conversation. But you know what I mean? Like, I just think back to last season when the Bears had D'Onta Foreman in that backfield, and for a while there, he was at the bottom of the depth chart. It was Herbert and Roschon Johnson, and Foreman really wasn't playing much. A healthy scratch for a number of games last season, and there was some frustration there, I would imagine. He played a little bit in week 1 and then was inactive for weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5. Somewhere along the lines, I don't have the exact timeline in front of me, Khalil Herbert gets hurt, and they need a number 1 running back, and it's not going to be Roschon Johnson, so in comes D'Onta Foreman. And he goes on a nice little run there, has a couple of big touchdowns against the Raiders, helps them win that game, has 89 yards. Against the Saints, he had 83 yards. Against the Panthers, he had 80 yards. Like, he looked like a pretty solid running back last season. And he went from totally inactive to number 1 running back on the depth chart because of injury, and then back to totally inactive. But it was super valuable for the Bears to have Foreman around, even though he didn't win the competition, even though he was buried on the depth chart, and there were 2 running backs ahead of him getting all the playing time, and he was inactive and probably not happy about it. Certainly paid off that he was still there. They could have cut D'Onta Foreman. They could have, I guess, traded him for a 7th round pick, but having him in the backfield for those games as the team, that was like right when they started turning things around a little bit after the 1-4 start. Like, they got the offense going a little bit, and then of course Fields gets hurt, but like, he helped Tyson Bagent win 2 games over that stretch. Like, he was a big part of that at that time. And so why would you get rid of that for nothing, for a 6th or 7th round pick? Like, that's what Khalil Herbert can be. Even if Swift is your number 1 running back and Roschon Johnson is your number 2. All it takes is an injury to either of those guys for Khalil Herbert to step right back in, be that guy who we've seen go off for big games, and obviously, as we talk about, like, has more ability as a receiver as well that they can still tap into. But first and foremost, can be that great runner if you need a really good runner to step in, even if he's inactive for a bunch of other games. Like, he's more valuable to the Bears as a running back insurance policy this season than a 6th or 7th round pick via trade. Like, we've seen this guy have 125-yard games. You don't just give up that for a late round pick that likely won't pan out. You hold on to him, even if he's on the bench, because he's not expensive. You're not saving any salary cap money by cutting Khalil Herbert. He's young. He's talented. Like, he's more valuable to the Bears, even on the bench, than he is to be a trade for a late round pick, or certainly to cut him frivolously for no reason. And I also just don't think if you moved on from Herbert and your backfield was Swift, Roschon Johnson, and Travis Homer, like, is that enough running back depth there? Do you trust Travis Homer enough if you have to play him significant snaps if there's an injury? Like, Herbert's sticking around. He's not on the roster bubble. At best, he could be traded if a team gets desperate. And if they give you that 5th round pick, we can talk about it, but I don't think that's very likely. I don't think teams are likely going to overspend to trade for Khalil Herbert. And so I think the Bears are going to keep him. Whether he's the number 2 or not is the competition still to be determined, but he's going to be on this roster even if he's inactive and a healthy scratch on game days, because you never know when Khalil Herbert might just come in handy at some point during the season. Certainly, we'll keep close tabs on how these 2 running backs are battling throughout training camp right here in the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And with the Bears reporting back to training camp, we are here every day. We're back to a full 5 days a week from here on out. I mean, barring, sickness or something, there's always occasional things that might pop up, but like, I'm planning on being here 5 days a week for you throughout the rest of the NFL season. Football is here. The rookies report, I think, tomorrow or at the end of the week. I don't have the exact date in front of me. I think it's anyway. So players are going to be practicing sooner rather than later. We're going to have like real updates to get to here to really sink our teeth into. So make sure you keep tuning in every day to the Locked On Bears podcast for your daily training camp updates and your daily opportunity to bear down.